What are the aims of education? Education has influenced the world more than anything else. All that we see around us in terms of achievement of man or resultant of man's activities can be attributed as manifestations of education. It is education that has transformed the man from an ape-like hunting beast of a few thousand years ago into the most developed and civilized master of the globe. Education aids the human being to pursue wholeness, which implies the harmonious development of all the potentialities that nature has provided him. Education has limitlessly enhanced the standard of living of human beings, rapidly leading us to new inventions and discoveries. As a result of it, the society we live in is ever changing. We have to cope with this change and also to intelligently carve a desired way to project ourselves into future. Moreover, education is the oldest and the biggest enterprise of man in terms of manpower engaged in its pursuit with a multidimensional life. True education is the harmonious development of the physical, mental, moral, spiritual, and social faculties. It can, therefore, never be an unplanned and aimless venture or purposeless activity. To think of the why and the how of education before we actually go in for it is a prerequisite. Education without proper and well-defined aims, objectives, goals, and motives is quite unthinkable. No educator can dare talk of education without mentioning its goals, aim, and purpose or objectives. An education without the knowledge of aims, objectives, and goals of education is like a sailor navigating a ship without the knowledge of destination and route. So, aims are a must for education and need to be laid down explicitly. So, what are the concepts of aims? Aims of education are not fixed, eternal, and universal. These are changeable and relative. The nature of the aims of education can properly be understood in the light of two distinct philosophies of life: idealism and pragmatism. Idealism stands for absolute, eternal, and universal values. It advocates high ideals of life, which are mainly spiritual in nature. Idealism pleads knowledge for knowledge's sake. In an idealist society, education is for the general and moral development of a person. According to idealism, education should not only stress the development of the mind, but also encourage students to focus on all things of lasting value. The aims of education are predetermined, absolute, unchangeable, and universal. The aim of idealist education is to realize these pre-existing, absolute, and universal values. It is education for a complete living. The socio-political ideologies also determine the aims of education. A democratic government, a fascist government, a communist government, each one formulates its own ends and means of education. Democratic ideals of life are flexible and they change with the changing conditions of life. Hence, In a democracy, the highest development of the innate potentialities of the individual are aimed at, while in fascism, the individual exists for the state and the education is aimed at the glorification and welfare of the state. Man is regarded to be the creature of the state. Social and economic issues determine educational aims and objectives. Education must prepare the future generation for the economic and social system of the country. In determining its educational objectives, every country has to take into consideration its economic conditions. So, we find variability is the nature of educational aims. The Secondary Education Commission puts it this way: as the political, social, and economic conditions change and new problems arise, it becomes necessary to re examine carefully and restate clearly the objectives which education at definite stage should keep in view. Now, let us see the importance of educational aims. According to Encyclopedia of Modern Education, education is purposeful and ethical activity. Hence, it is unthinkable without aims. For achieving success in life, a clear and well-defined aim is essential. An educator without the knowledge of aims can be compared to a sailor who does not know his destination. This means that a system of education which is not clear about its aims or which has undesirable ends is bound to fail. Aims give foresight to the educational planner. All our methods of teaching, our curriculum, and our system of evaluation are shaped and molded according to our educational aims. It is the ignorance of right aims that has vitiated our educational system, its methods, and its products, and has resulted in the physical, intellectual, and moral weaknesses of the race. There, it is a great necessity of aims in education because of certain reasons. First, it helps us to direct efforts. If aim is known, we can take efforts to that end. Educational aims keep the teacher and the taught on the right track. They provide a line of action and guidance to the teachers. They give direction and zest to the work of the pupils. Secondly, it seeks to avoid wastage. Educational aims help us to avoid wastage in time and energy. In the words of John Dewey, to have an aim is to act with meaning. Aims help us to act intelligently and act meaningfully. We know what is to be done and we straight away start doing that. Thirdly, how do we evaluate ourselves? Educational aims help us to evaluate ourselves. They take stock of the results of our effort. The aim is a yardstick with which we can measure our success and failure. They are necessary to assess the outcome of the educational process. To provide efficient school administration, aims are necessary for efficient school administration and organization. They help the school authorities in organizing, equipping, and administering the school. Various aspects of school administration and organization, such as proper selection of teachers, proper curricular and co-curricular activities, are guided by educational aims. It is rightly said that good schools evolve out of enlightened aims. aims are guidelines in the educational process. Like the sun, aims illumine our life. The ignorance of right aims spoils the whole educational system. We as educators carefully evaluate the existing conditions. For example, the contents of education, methods of teaching, efficiency of teaching, library equipment, planning of curricular and co-curricular activities in the light of our objective and plan for the future. Now, let us see how aims of education have evolved through history. In ancient India, the ideal of life was spiritualistic. Educational aim was determined by the conception of life. Thus, the aim of education was self realization or the realization of Brahma or the Absolute. The ancient Sparta education was not individualistic but socialistic. Each man was born not for himself but for the state. The state itself was a school. The immediate aim of this state controlled system of education was to train the youths in military barracks away from home, to develop a hardy mind in a hardy body, to produce courageous soldiers. Individual liberty was not allowed. Education was primarily physical. In Athens, the individual occupied pivotal position in the educational field. Athenian education aimed at harmonious development of personality, physical, intellectual, moral, and aesthetic. It secured harmony between the individual and the state, between physical and mental development, between thought and action. Its immediate aim was to develop a beautiful mind in a beautiful body. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the Greek idealists, discarded extremely individualistic aim of education. Socrates emphasized on the acquisition of universal and eternal knowledge of truth. Plato advocated harmonious development of all the powers of the individual and equated personal realization with social solidarity. Aristotle championed the ideal of harmony between the individual and the society, between intellect and character, and theory as well as practice. The ancient Romans had no interest in the acquisition of purely theoretical knowledge. Their outlook was materialistic. Their highest aim of life was the attainment of material success. The aim of Roman education was to produce a worthy citizen of the Roman state who was able to enjoy the rights and perform the duties of a citizen. During the Middle Ages, education was wholly a priestly affair. Mysticism, monasticism, chivalry, and scholasticism dominated life in every field. Education was absolutely formal in character and religious in outlook. With the passage of time, this liberal humanistic education degenerated into an artificial and formal system. Against this artificial education, the realistic movement started under the leadership of Bacon and Comenius. According to them, ignorance was at the root of all evils. So they pleaded spread of universal and integrated knowledge. The child's individuality, his powers, and interests were given supreme importance. Due to religious, social, psychological, and pedagogical reasons, a new theory of education known as theory of mental or formal discipline came into vogue. John Locke was the historical representative of this new doctrine. According to him, the aim of education should be to produce a sound mind in a sound body. The aim of education would be to discipline all the faculties such as memory, imagination, perception, and thinking. A true individualistic ideal of education came into existence in the 18th century. J. Rousseau revolted against the existing artificial and demoralized system of education. He not only championed the cause of the common people, but also the cause of the child in the field of education. Thus, naturalism appeared in education. Rousseau's concept of negative education emphasized education according to nature. The child was regarded as an important central factor in the field of education. The aim of education should be spontaneous, natural self-development of the child's nature in close contact with nature. Kant was definitely influenced by the individualistic concept of education and defined education as the process by which man becomes a man on his own. Pestalozzi introduced the psychological angle to education, and with it, the child-centric movement, which received a new momentum and fillip. According to him, education was the process of the spontaneous unfolding of latent powers of the individual towards perfection. Harbert shouldered this task, and he developed a systematic psychology of the methods of teaching. Froebel, the German idealist, regarded education as the spontaneous development of a joyful, creative self-activity. From the above survey of the educational ideals, it is evident that the aims and functions of education have been variously defined in different ages by different educators. Hence, we can conclude by saying that aims of education are not fixed and static, but these are subject to constant change and dynamic. So, what are the factors determining educational aims? There are many factors that contribute to the determining of educational aims. These factors touch every phase of human life that ever was, is, or ever will be. The important factors which are responsible for deciding the aims of education may be discussed under 7 categories. First, it's the philosophy of life. Aims of education are always influenced by the philosophy of life of the people. Idealistic philosophy lays down different aims like education for self-realization. Pragmatists have no faith in any fixed aim of education. The philosophy prevailing in the life of the people is reflected in the aims of education of that country. Next comes the political ideology. Political ideologies also help in determining the aims of education. Different political ideologies like democratic, totalitarian, fascist, or communist will fix different aims of education in the state. The aims of education under democratic state are flexible and change according to changing needs and conditions of many, on the contrary, in a totalitarian state. The aims of education are fixed in accordance with the ideology of the state to uphold the right of state. Another important factor is the socio-economic problem. Besides political ideologies The social economic problems of a country determine the aims of education. Education is a vital force which can silently bury the socio-economic problems. It can thus evolve a society based on equality, cooperation, and socialistic ideals. We also have the psychological factor. The aims of education should be according to the nature, needs, requirements, inspiration, and the interest of the learners. If the aims of education are not in tune with the music of life, they will prove futile, useless, fruitless, and ineffective. The aims of education should relate knowledge with the activities of life. Exploration of knowledge. Education has also to give due consideration to the advancements in knowledge as far as the question of educational aims are concerned. Education today has become science oriented all over the world. Like in other countries, in India also, more and more stress is being laid on the study of modern sciences. This clearly shows the spread of new knowledge is an important factor in determining the aims of education. One cannot exclude the role of religion in determining the aims. Education and religion have close relationship. They affect society in different ways. Different religious viewpoints influence the aims of education. There are a large number of institutions run by different religious organizations. They have to work to realize the aims accordingly. Cultural factor. Cultural heritage of a country also determines the aims of education. It is the most important function of the education to develop and preserve the cultural heritage. The changing and developing pattern of cultural factors directly influence the aims of education. What are the different aims of education? We have the individual and specific aims of education. Individual aims lay emphasis on the growth of individuality and freedom, whereas social aims emphasize on the development of the society and its solidarity. These individual and social aims are determined according to the political system or social ideas of the concerned society. What are the aims directed towards the individual? Education should aim at the training and development of the individual. The individual is supreme. His interests and needs should be given importance over others. Every individual is unique and contribute to the social progress in his own way. Good individuals can become good citizens, and education should prepare good individuals. Social institutions, particularly the schools, should provide all favorable facilities for a child's development. No two individuals are identical in interests, powers, and abilities. Education has to provide an opportunity to know and develop these qualities. Therefore, suitable education has to be provided depending upon the traits of the individual. The social aim of education. Education for the individual is good, but it should not become an obstacle to the society. Humans are part of the society, and when they communicate and exchange views and ideas with each other, they receive knowledge and information, and that is how they make themselves educated. Education should have a social aim, as the social value, customs, and the environment make the individual socialized. Education should also develop social consciousness. Social consciousness will help the individual to know how to live in a society, how to behave, and how to solve problems. This aim of education will develop the motive of sacrifice, and service among people. School is the small reflection of the society. So, education should be a bridge between the individual and the society. Gandhiji also advocated this aim of education. Even though social aim limits the individuality, it protects the desires of the society. How does individual aim fare against social aim? These two aims seem to be contradictory and opposed to each other. If we stress individual aim too much, it will produce egoists, while extreme emphasis on social aim will create suppressed personalities. So these two aims should not be opposite but complementary to each other. One cannot exist without the other. By integrating both aims, we can achieve a lot more. Aims of education in ancient India. The aim of education in ancient India was the ultimate outcome of the Indian theory of knowledge and the corresponding scheme of life and values. People in ancient India were greatly impressed and affected by the fact of death as the central fact of life. Their one aim of life was to solve the problem of death by figuring out whole truth of which life and death are the two faces. The aim was not simply abstract and theoretical. There were practical and concrete aims too. The first was the acquisition of knowledge. This was evident in the Vedic period. Inculcation of social and civic duties in the minds of the students was also regarded as an important aim of education in those days. Education for occupation was another important aim. Character training and moral education was regarded as very important aim of ancient Indian education. Aims of education in medieval India. During medieval age, religion was the main guiding force in life and society. Medieval civilization centered around religion. The Muslim rulers of India generally took a keen interest in education, and many of them founded schools, colleges, and libraries in various places in their kingdoms. The mosque was a center of instruction and of literary activity. Muslim education included those eternal teachings and values of the Quran and Hadith, which would promote moral and spiritual knowledge. Islamic education aimed at both physical and mental development of the students. Thus, it aimed at the total development of personality of the individual. Aims of education in British India. The British uprooted the indigenous system of education in India with definite intentions. The educational system established by the British was colonial in nature. It was designed to prepare Indians only for taking certain subordinate positions, in government offices especially. It was not intended to develop among the people capacities to take leadership and initiative in different walks of life. The main educational objective can be better understood from the following declaration in the educational policy of Lord Bentinck. He said, "We want a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinion, in morals and intellect." The Woods Dispatch declared almost the same policy. The aim of British education was to inculcate European knowledge in the minds of the Indians. Aims of education in modern India. Formulation of good educational policies with suitable aims of education and proper organization to achieve those aims is of prime importance. Therefore, the Government of India has appointed some commissions to formulate suitable aims of education. Secondary Education Commission constituted in 1952. Under the chairmanship of Dr. A, Lakshmanaswamy Mudaliar, the commission was framed to examine the prevailing system of secondary education in the country and to suggest measures for its organization and improvement. Indian Education Commission, constituted in 1964, analyzed the problem of national development and recommended that education should be related to life, needs, and aspirations of the people. The National Policy of Education formulated that education is for all and should develop the manpower, and proposed for delinking degrees from jobs and aimed at strengthening national institutes like the UGC, NCERT, NIEPA, AICTE, IMC, ICAR, and so on. The 1986 National Policy on Education was modified in 1992 by P.V. Narasimha Rao's government. In 2005, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh adopted a new policy based on the Common Minimum Program of his United Progressive Alliance government. Conclusion: an aim denotes the result of any natural process brought to consciousness and made a factor in determining how one should act. It signifies that an activity has become intelligent. Education should help in carefully considering all the best possible ways of acting in a situation and then choosing the right way, keeping in mind the consequences of it. Any imposition of thought on an individual that conflicts with what he naturally believes to be right is bound to be counterproductive. Instead of aiding in bringing out the best in the learner, it inhibits the creativity and limits the thinking process. The primary aim of education is to prepare the learner to prepare himself or herself to face real life challenges in future with conviction and authority. Externally imposed rules will only make the learner more and more dependent on external guidance, robbing them of their decision-making skills. Such an educational environment would make both the teacher and the taught mechanical in approach and would kill any new idea or initiative. According to James Ross, the aim of education is the development of valuable personality and spiritual individuality. The true aim of education cannot be other than the highest development of the individual as a member of society. Let education burn the individual flame, feeding it with the oil of society.